He made a critical mistake inside a public interview. The person sitting directly across from him never caught it. The millions of people who watched that interview never caught it either. But someone did. A former United States Army interrogator, a human intelligence collector trained by the federal government to sit across from people, listen to every single word, and identify the exact moment a story stops being consistent. He caught something that the entire internet missed. And today, we are going to break it down, word by word, second by second. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome to Crime with Chris. This channel is built on careful, documented analysis of cases that demand serious attention. If that's the kind of content you value, take 5 seconds right now, hit that subscribe button, and leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel continue doing this work. Now let's get into it.
I am a former Army interrogator, human intelligence collector. I was trained by the United States government to analyze your language, body language, posture to identify deception. I did it in the real world through interrogations, through source operations, and through strategic debriefings. I've got tons of certifications. I'm an expert at this.
You guys get ready to leave out of there, getting towed out. Yeah. And then where is Nolan in this situation?
Well, Nolan was... The last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
Last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. That is critically important information. Right here, he's talking about when his buddy Bart pulls out his buddy Wyatt's boat. So Bart is on one boat and he's pulling out Wyatt's boat. Wyatt's boat is the one that you've heard about was taken on water and sinking, and that's why they had to leave Horn Island. I want you to pay attention to this.
To where we're out of all this, all this chaos, because we left at 4:30 and there was still...
We left at 4:30. We left at 4:30. This guy just said that the last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. Very specific time. Now, how did he know it was 3 o'clock? Brandon Tatum didn't ask him that. If this was an interrogation, that's a key question I would ask. How do you know it was 3 o'clock?
And then where is Nolan in this situation?
Well, Nolan was... The last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
And Nolan was cradling a girl in his arms. Katie. Katie.
That's Katie McCormick that he's talking about. Katie McCormick said that's not true, but let's listen. This is at 3 o'clock. This happened at 3 o'clock.
And Nolan was sitting there, and the last time I saw him, I looked at Nolan, and Nolan was like shaking his head, laughing. That was the last time I laid eyes on him. But when we were leaving...
Well, when we were leaving, so it would be 4:30, because he's already said we were leaving at 4:30.
Nolan was sitting by the boat.
Nolan was sitting by the boat. How do you know, Warren, that Nolan was sitting by the boat? The last time you laid eyes on him was at 3 o'clock. It's now 4:30. This is your timeline. Timeline is everything. At this part of the story, he's at 4:30. But he just said less than a minute ago, 2 minutes ago, that the last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl, and...
How do you know that? The last time you laid eyes, your exact words, on him was 3 o'clock. You're now talking about 4:30. Now listen what happens next.
My buddy yelled for Nolan. Nolan, get on the boat. We're leaving.
Now, in the interest of honest analysis here, if they were both on the boat and he heard his buddy yelling at Nolan, not him, by the way. Warren wasn't yelling at Nolan. Even in his own story, he wasn't looking for Nolan or yelling for Nolan. And in the beginning of part 1 of the interview, he says, Nolan was like a brother to me. He was my best friend. More than a friend, though. He was like a brother to me. But Warren's not the one looking for Nolan, not the one yelling for Nolan. He don't even go over and lay eyes on him again, according to his own story that he's telling us. But he hears his buddy saying, hey, Nolan.
The boat's having issues. And no, he didn't say that, but he was panicking. Nolan, get the F on the boat. Get on the boat. And Nolan said, no, I'm staying out here. I'm going to ride in with somebody else. And it's not uncommon to hear. It's not like my buddy asked him one time. My buddy asked Nolan multiple times to get.
So your buddy asked Nolan multiple times and you never did. Your brother, your best friend, But notice he didn't say Nolan said, I'm going to stay here with Katie who I'm sitting with next to the boat. No part of that exchange would have given Warren the details to know that Nolan was sitting by the boat with Katie, which was his exact words. He contradicted himself. That's blatant deception. It needs to be immediately explored.
His name was Nolan Xavier Wells. He was 18 years old. He grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and by every account from every person who knew him, he was exactly the kind of young man you root for. He played football. He was heading into his freshman year at Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he was expected to compete at the collegiate level. He was supposed to return to football camp the very day after the 4th of July. The holiday weekend was his last chance to breathe before the work started. And like a lot of 18-year-olds in that part of Mississippi on a holiday weekend, he spent it on the water. Horn Island sits roughly 10 miles off the southern coast of Mississippi. It is a barrier island, undeveloped, accessible only by boat, and on the 4th of July, it draws hundreds of people every year looking for a beach day away from the crowds on the mainland. On the morning of July 4th, Nolan Wells boarded a boat with a group of his closest friends and headed out there. 3 boats made that trip. The group was large, the day was long, and by all accounts it started like any other holiday on the water. But Nolan Wells never made it home. His mother, Christine Wansley, filed a missing person report at midnight on July 4th, after hours of silence and no word from her son. A search effort launched immediately and stretched through the following day. On the morning of July 6th, at approximately 8:45 in the morning, a body was recovered near the northwest end of Horn Island. Dental records confirmed what the family feared. The body was Nolan Wells. The Jackson County coroner officially identified him. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office stated publicly that they believed Nolan had drowned and that foul play was not suspected. But in the very same statement, investigators made clear they were working diligently to determine exactly what occurred. Those two things, a drowning conclusion and an active effort to determine what happened, have existed side by side ever since. And that tension is exactly why this case has not gone away. Because the questions that Nolan's family, his friends, and thousands of people across the country are sitting with do not start with how he died. They start with a narrower, more specific question. What happened in the 90 minutes before that boat left without him? Here is what the timeline shows, based on documented records from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. The boat departed the mainland at 9:56 in the morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14. The group spent the afternoon there. One of the boats began taking on water, a bilge pump issue that forced the situation, and the decision was made to leave. The boat arrived back on the mainland at 5:44 in the evening. That much is documented. What is also documented, through an independent analytical review completed in the days following Nolan's death, is that the available evidence contains what investigators described as a material gap in the timeline. That gap begins at 3 in the afternoon, the last moment that Nolan Wells was independently and corroborated confirmed to have been seen, and ends at 4:31, when the boat pulled away from Horn Island. 90 minutes. Every unresolved question in this case lives inside that window. And the only time one of Nolan's closest friends publicly tried to account for what happened inside those 90 minutes was during a media interview conducted in the days after Nolan's body was found. The friend's name is Warren Hudson. He sat down with media personality Brandon Tatum alongside 2 other members of the group, and over the course of that interview, he walked through his version of the day, where he was, where Nolan was, what was said, and what happened in the moments before the boat left. It was a voluntary interview. It was not a law enforcement interrogation, and that distinction is going to matter significantly before this video is over. Now, to understand why this interview became the center of so much scrutiny, you need to understand the 2 accounts of Nolan's final moments that existed before Warren Hudson ever sat down in front of a camera. Account 1 comes from the friend group's version of events, delivered by Warren on camera. In his telling, The group was preparing to leave, and Nolan was asked multiple times to get on the boat. Warren described his friend yelling directly at Nolan, "Get on the boat, we're leaving," and Nolan refusing. In Warren's version, Nolan said he was going to stay and ride back to the mainland with somebody else. That was his choice. That was his decision. Account 2 comes from the family of Katie McCormack. Katie was a young woman Nolan had spent part of that afternoon with on Horn Island. Her sister Gracie posted a public statement on behalf of the family. According to that statement, Nolan's friends had been pressuring him to wrap up his time with Katie so they could leave together. Katie assumed that Nolan was heading back to the boat with his group. She believed his friends would not leave without him. She made it home that day on a completely separate boat. She never saw him again. Two people, both physically present, both describing the same short exchange, both arriving at opposite conclusions about which direction Nolan thought he was walking when that conversation ended. In Warren's version, Nolan chose to stay. In Katie's family's version, Nolan believed he was going with them. And then there is a third data point that sits underneath both of those accounts and quietly changes the weight of everything. Nolan's closest friend, Javon Williams, told CNN on the record that in the entire time he had known Nolan Wells, through years of friendship, countless trips, and every situation that came up, he had never once seen Nolan stay behind when his group left. Not once. Nolan's parents confirmed the same thing independently. Christine and Elmore Wansley both stated publicly that they raised their son with one consistent, non-negotiable rule. You go with the group. You come back with the group. His best friend said it. His mother said it. His father said it. 3 separate people, each speaking independently, all describing the same lifelong behavioral pattern. And the account provided by Warren Hudson requires you to believe that Nolan broke that pattern for the first and only time on the one afternoon it cost him his life. Does that prove that something happened to Nolan against his will? No. People break patterns. An 18-year-old meets someone new on a beach, has a conversation, and for once makes a different call. That is not impossible, but it is a detail that investigators have to weigh. And it pulls against the version of events where Nolan simply, casually decided to stay behind without telling anyone, without making arrangements, and without being seen by a single person on that island after his group departed. Now, let's get to the interview itself, because this is where it becomes specific. This is where the former Army interrogator stepped in. And this is where 2 statements, separated by less than 2 minutes of recorded conversation, directly contradict each other in a way that was never addressed. Brandon Tatum asked Warren Hudson directly where Nolan was when the group was getting ready to leave. Warren's response in his own words was this: "The last time I saw Nolan was 3, not sometime around the middle of the afternoon, not a vague reference to a while before they left. 3, specific, confident, a precise hour, stated without hesitation." He then described what he saw at that moment. He said Nolan was holding Katie in his arms. He said Nolan was shaking his head and laughing. And then he said, and these were his exact words, "That was the last time I laid eyes on him." Those words are the baseline. That is the line that everything else has to be measured against. The last time he laid eyes on Nolan was 3. Now, a short time later in that same interview, Warren was describing the departure, the group gathering, the boat situation, the push to get everyone moving by 4:30. And listen to what he said. "Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl. His buddy," he said, then yelled at Nolan to get on the boat. And Nolan said he was staying. Think about the mechanics of that for just a moment. If the last time you saw someone was 3, you cannot describe where that person was sitting an hour and a half later. You cannot name who they were sitting with. You cannot describe their specific physical position near a specific boat 90 minutes after you stated clearly that you stopped seeing them. That level of visual detail, a specific person, a specific location, a specific posture, does not come from overhearing a conversation across a beach. It comes from seeing something directly. But Warren had already told us, in his own words, that the last time he laid eyes on Nolan was 3. Those two statements are 90 minutes apart on his own timeline. They were spoken less than 2 minutes apart in the same interview. That is not an interpretation. That is not speculation. That is two pieces of Warren Hudson's own account placed directly next to each other, and they do not fit. A former U.S. Army interrogator, trained specifically to identify exactly this type of structural inconsistency, reviewed this interview and identified the contradiction immediately. His professional assessment, delivered publicly, used specific language. He called it blatant deception, and he explained what should have happened the moment it appeared. In a real interrogation setting, that is the moment you stop. You do not ask the next question. You go back. You press. You make the subject reconcile both statements before a single other topic is introduced, because unresolved contradictions are where the real information lives. That moment never came in this interview. Brandon Tatum did not catch it, did not stop, did not circle back. The conversation kept moving forward. The same interrogator pointed out a second issue that almost no one else flagged. In Warren's own telling of the story, he is never the one looking for Nolan. He is never the one calling out for him. He is never the one walking over to check on his friend before the boat leaves. It is Warren's buddy who yells for Nolan, not Warren. And remember, this is the same interview where Warren opened by describing Nolan as more than a friend. He said in his own words that Nolan was like a brother to him. But when the boat is about to leave and his brother is not on it, Warren does not go look for him. He does not call out for him. He does not walk over and lay eyes on him one more time. In his own story, that job falls to someone else entirely. Now, in the interest of fair and honest analysis, because that is what this channel is committed to, there is an innocent explanation for the timeline contradiction, and it deserves to be stated with the same weight as everything else. Human memory under emotional stress is unreliable. That is not an opinion. That is decades of documented forensic psychology research. When people experience chaotic high-emotion events, a holiday with 200 people on a beach, a boating emergency, the pressure of getting a group home, they compress time. They merge separate memories into single narrated sequences. They conflate what they directly experienced with what they heard or generally sensed. Warren may have merged two genuinely separate things. His last meaningful, direct interaction with Nolan around 3 in the afternoon, and a general sense of where Nolan was as the group was loading up, smashed together into one narrated account that sounds far more specific than it actually was. People do this constantly when recounting emotionally significant days. It is documented. It happens. And it is not, on its own, evidence of concealment. That is one explanation. The other is this. If Warren Hudson did have direct visual contact with Nolan at 4:30, close enough to identify his exact position near the boat and who he was sitting with, then the statement, "That was the last time I laid eyes on him," at 3 is not accurate, and the interview never returned to address that. Warren has publicly stated, through his family, that he has cooperated fully with investigators. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has confirmed that formal, separate witness interviews are part of the active investigation. Whether Warren's account to law enforcement resolves this contradiction clearly and completely is something the public does not yet know, because that information has not been released. What we do know is that a body language expert named Susan Constantine, brought in by a major media outlet to analyze Warren's full interview with Brandon Tatum, delivered a separate and specific finding. She assessed Warren as appearing largely truthful across most of the conversation, but when the discussion turned to Nolan's phone, she noted a distinct shift in his demeanor. She described hesitation. She described self-comfort behaviors, and her professional conclusion, stated clearly, was that on the specific question of Nolan's phone, Warren was not telling the full truth. She was equally clear that this did not lead her to conclude that foul play was involved in Nolan's death. It led her to conclude that Warren's account of the phone is incomplete, and the phone is its own question entirely. Because what Nolan's family found when they retrieved that device, or more precisely, what they did not find, opened a completely separate line of inquiry. Messages had been deleted. The family's discovery of those deletions ultimately brought the matter to the attention of the FBI. That investigation is active, and that is where Part 2 begins. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, something you had not heard framed this way before, take a second right now and show it. Leave a like on this video. Drop a comment with your thoughts. And if you are not already subscribed to Crime with Chris, now is the time. Every subscriber makes it possible to keep bringing you this level of documented, careful analysis on cases that deserve real attention. Part 2 is coming, and what comes next is the part nobody has fully laid out yet. There is something important you need to understand about the interview that started this entire conversation. Brandon Tatum is a media personality, a former police officer, and a man with a large and loyal platform. None of that is a criticism, but it is a structural fact that changes everything about how that interview should be evaluated. Because a media interview and a law enforcement interrogation are not the same instrument. They do not have the same goals. They do not operate under the same discipline. And when a contradiction surfaces inside one of them, the outcomes are completely different. In a formal investigative interview conducted by trained law enforcement, a contradiction is not a speed bump. It is the destination. When a subject's own timeline folds back on itself, a trained interviewer stops the conversation completely. They go back. They ask the subject to reconcile both statements before a single new question is introduced. That is not optional. That is the entire architecture of the job. Because in real investigative work, the contradiction is the interview. Everything important lives inside it. The conversation Warren Hudson had with Brandon Tatum was built around a different purpose entirely. It was a sympathetic space designed to give a grieving friend the opportunity to tell his side of the story publicly. That is a legitimate thing to offer someone, but it is not an interrogation. And when the single biggest unresolved contradiction in the entire public record of this case appeared inside that conversation, it passed through without a word. That is what the Army interrogator caught. That is what millions of viewers missed. And as this case now moves toward a grand jury, that is what investigators are going to have to sit with. So let's talk about what the full weight of evidence actually looks like. Because a contradiction inside a single interview does not exist in isolation. It has to be placed alongside everything else. The phone, the autopsies, the physical evidence, the expert analysis, and when you stack all of it together, the picture that emerges is not clean. Not in either direction. And before we go any further, if you found part 1 of this breakdown and you are back for part 2, thank you. That means something on a channel this size. If you have not yet subscribed to Crime with Chris, this is the moment to do it. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a like on this video. And stay with us, because what comes next in this case is going to demand the same level of careful attention we have tried to bring to every piece of it. Now let's get into the evidence. Start with the phone. When the group returned to the mainland without Nolan, his phone was still on the boat. His parents located it using a family tracking application and recovered it from a friend's home. When Christine Wansley and her sister went through the device, specifically checking Snapchat for any photos or videos from July 4th, they found nothing. No saved content from that day. None. And this is important. They retrieved the phone within the 24-hour window before content on that platform would naturally expire on its own. Nolan's friends offered an explanation for this. Everyone, they said, had left their phones on the boat's dashboard throughout the day, a common practice to protect devices from saltwater exposure. Cell service at Horn Island is limited, which means content may not have synced before the phones were left behind. That explanation is plausible. It is entirely possible. It deserves to be stated plainly, because it is a legitimate alternative to the more troubling reading of the same facts. But attorney Tyler Bailey, a civil rights and criminal defense attorney who has spoken publicly about the case, raised a specific counterpoint worth considering. Nolan Wells had spent the afternoon with a young woman he was clearly interested in. Most 18-year-olds in that situation want a way to stay in contact afterward. Choosing to leave your phone behind when you are in the middle of trying to exchange information with someone you just met does not align with what most teenagers do in that moment. That is not proof of anything. It is one more small detail that does not resolve cleanly on its own. What happened next with the phone moved this beyond ordinary dispute. Both sides agreed to a joint, simultaneous forensic inspection. The family's forensic experts and law enforcement reviewing the same device at the same time, pulling the same data through the same process, watching each other work in real time. Legal analysts who have followed this case publicly described that arrangement as highly unusual outside of cases already moving towards serious criminal proceedings. When two sides agree to that structure, it is because both understand that what is on that device could be decisive. As of this recording, the results of that joint inspection have not been publicly confirmed as complete. The phone is one open question. The autopsies are another. The independent autopsy was conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist, former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., and president of the National Medical Association. He presented his preliminary findings publicly in Chicago on July 22nd. His conclusion, as reported by the family's attorney Ben Crump, was that the cause and manner of Nolan's death are undetermined, pending further investigation. Not drowning, not homicide, undetermined. And the findings raised specific questions that remain unanswered. Dr. Mitchell found a large area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. No skull fractures were present, no external lacerations. But that discoloration was documented, and according to Crump, Mitchell concluded it deserves further investigation. Dr. Mitchell was also unable to determine whether water was present in Nolan's lungs. That matters more than it might sound. Water in the lungs is one of the primary forensic indicators that a person was alive and actively breathing at the moment they entered the water. Without that finding, the question of whether Nolan entered the water conscious or unconscious, voluntarily or under other circumstances, remains open. But the detail that stopped people cold was something else entirely. When Nolan's body arrived for the independent autopsy, specific internal structures of the neck were not included. The trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the hyoid bone, the thyroid structures, all absent, according to Dr. Mitchell. Because those structures were not present, the independent pathologist could not rule out injury to Nolan's neck as a contributing factor in or cause of his death. Without examining those structures directly, that question cannot be closed. Before that becomes more than what it actually is. Precision matters here. Dr. Mitchell himself noted that retaining anterior neck structures during an initial autopsy is not by itself unusual. It is a recognized practice in forensic pathology. His own report acknowledged that retention of those structures occurs in cases where there are concerns about neck fractures or compression injuries. He did not claim their absence constituted wrongdoing. He did not say it pointed toward anything specific. What he said was that he did not know why they were retained in this particular case, and think carefully about what that statement also means. If those structures are retained precisely when there are concerns about neck compression, their retention in Nolan's case is itself a question, not a conclusion, but a question that the investigation must address. The state medical examiner's office stated publicly that the autopsy was performed in accordance with standard procedures and protocols. They declined to engage with the independent findings and maintained publicly that assumptions should be avoided until the investigation is complete. Their full findings have not been released. They will not be released until they are placed in front of a grand jury. That is now confirmed. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, speaking with a major news outlet, offered a different read on the independent findings. In his assessment, the red discoloration at the back of Nolan's head does not point toward foul play. He described the independent autopsy as reaching for conclusions the evidence does not fully support, and characterized the findings as consistent with accidental death. That perspective is real, credentialed, and belongs in this conversation. Two qualified forensic pathologists reviewed the same underlying case, and they arrived at different assessments. One concluded the evidence does not rule out foul play. The other concluded the evidence does not support it. That divergence has not been resolved. It will not be resolved until both sets of complete findings, including toxicology, are placed in front of the grand jury. Nobody outside of that investigation knows what the state examination found. That information is sealed. Here is what is not sealed. Approximately 60 witness interviews have been conducted. The FBI has been brought in to assist with digital forensics, phone data, audio, and video analysis. That involvement was confirmed publicly by Sheriff John Ledbetter himself. Ben Crump's legal team separately retained forensic audio specialists to conduct a complete review of the emergency call placed that day. And there is now an additional line of inquiry that has not received enough attention, but deserves it. Crump announced publicly that the family is consulting with oceanic engineering experts to examine one specific question. Nolan's body was recovered 2 days after he disappeared, near the northwestern tip of Horn Island, described in multiple accounts as the same general area where he was last seen. The family's experts want to know whether the tidal movement around Horn Island over those 2 days is scientifically consistent with a body entering the water at that location and being recovered at that same location 2 days later, or whether the currents, tides, and drift patterns suggest something different about where Nolan actually entered the water. That analysis has not been completed, but it is now a formal part of the independent investigation. Notice what all of these threads have in common: the phone, the autopsies, the audio review, the tidal analysis. Every line of active inquiry in this case converges on the same unresolved center. What happened to Nolan Wells inside that 90-minute window between 3 and 4:31 on the 4th of July? Every piece of pending evidence points back toward that same gap, and the only person who gave a public account of that window said 2 things that structurally cannot both be accurate. Now, one more time, and with full sincerity, fairness requires returning to Warren Hudson directly. He has not been charged with any crime. No law enforcement agency has named him as a suspect. His mother, Judge Ashley Cole, stated publicly that Warren has cooperated fully with Jackson County investigators. According to Sheriff Ledbetter, Warren's account of that afternoon has been consistent in its broad shape across multiple separate retellings. The contradiction identified in the interview could genuinely reflect a memory under stress, a documented, researched, scientifically established reality about how human beings recall emotional days. That happens to honest people. It is not a marker of deception on its own, and the fact that Warren gave that interview at all, voluntarily, in the days after losing a friend, deserves to be part of any honest evaluation of his conduct. What can be said carefully, specifically, and without exaggeration is this: a documented gap exists in the public record of this case. A formal investigative interview conducted by trained law enforcement in a controlled individual setting is the instrument specifically designed to catch and resolve exactly that kind of gap. Whether that interview has happened in the way it needs to, and whether Warren's account to investigators reconciles the 3 and 4:30 statements clearly, is something the public cannot confirm, because law enforcement has not released that information. If it reconciles cleanly, that matters significantly. If it does not reconcile, that matters in a different and more serious way. Neither outcome should be assumed before the evidence is placed on the table. There is one more dimension to this case that cannot be passed over. Nolan Wells was, according to the Associated Press, the only black person on that boat. He was the only one who did not come home. His family's publicly stated distrust of the investigation is rooted in that reality. Ben Crump said directly at a press conference that the family has concerns about whether Mississippi law enforcement will conduct a fully fair investigation given that their black son died after spending the day on a boat with 3 young white men. Reverend Al Sharpton, who appeared alongside the family, stated clearly that the family is not centering race as the definitive explanation for what happened to Nolan, but they are not dismissing it as a factor requiring honest examination. That is a specific, measured position, and it deserves to be represented accurately rather than reduced to something it is not. A combined reward of $125,000 has been offered jointly by Reverend Sharpton, actor and producer Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens for any information leading to an arrest and conviction in connection with Nolan's death. That reward is confirmed and currently active. According to the district attorney's office, between 50 and 100 tips per day have been coming into official and independent tip lines. People who were on Horn Island that day, people who know someone who was. That is an extraordinary volume for a single case, and it reflects something real. A community and increasingly a nation that has decided these questions deserve genuine answers. The case will go to a grand jury. District Attorney Angel Myers Mroth confirmed that publicly. What a grand jury can examine is broad. It is not limited to questions of homicide. It can consider obstruction, the handling of evidence, questions about how information was shared or withheld, and any evidence bearing on how Nolan actually died. That does not mean any of those things occurred. It means those are the categories the process is structurally capable of examining, depending entirely on what evidence is placed before it. And a grand jury referral is not an indictment, not a charge, and not a conclusion. The district attorney herself described it as standard practice in Jackson County for any death that is neither natural nor accidental at the point of initial determination. Those are her words. 4 specific developments still pending will shape what this case becomes. The state toxicology results and the final official autopsy findings. These are the closest thing this case has to objective physical evidence, and whether they align with or diverge from the independent pathologist's undetermined conclusion will carry significant weight. The results of the joint phone inspection. If deliberate deletion is documented, the case changes shape. If a technical explanation emerges, that matters equally and must be reported with the same honesty. The oceanic tidal analysis, whether the location of Nolan's recovery is scientifically consistent with where he reportedly entered the water, has a factual answer. And when it arrives, it will either support or significantly complicate the current account. And the grand jury itself, sealed by design. But whatever it produces will be the closest thing to a formal answer this case is likely to reach in the near term. On July 20th, Nolan's family held his homegoing celebration at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, followed by a celebration of life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. Christine Wansley said publicly she wanted it to feel less like a funeral and more like the kind of gathering Nolan himself would have loved: music, community, people together. His mother has now gone nearly a month without hearing her son's voice. When reporters asked what she wanted the public to know about him, Christine said that Nolan had a gentle, calming spirit, and that he had a way of making people feel seen, welcome, and valued. That description did not come only from his mother. His football coaches said it. His teachers said it. Javon Williams told CNN independently. His teammates reflected it. None of those people coordinated with each other. When a description of someone arrives from enough separate directions, without any of those sources speaking to one another, it stops being a description and starts being a portrait. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. 2 nights before he left for Horn Island, he cooked salmon for his parents. He hugged his mother, told her he loved her, and walked out the door on an ordinary 4th of July morning. The kind of morning every parent has watched happen 100 times without once stopping to think about it. He was not the loudest person in the room. He was the one who remembered your name and asked how your week was going. He made people feel worth paying attention to. 60 witnesses have been interviewed. The FBI is involved. A grand jury is coming. 2 autopsies sit in sealed files. A phone is being examined simultaneously by both sides. An oceanic engineer is reviewing tidal drift patterns. And somewhere inside those sealed files, those pending reports, and those 60 witness interviews is an answer that Christine and Elmore Wansley are still waiting for. What we know for certain is that Warren Hudson made 2 statements inside a single interview that cannot both be literally true. The last time he laid eyes on Nolan was 3. And then, less than 2 minutes later, a detailed, visual, specific account of where Nolan was sitting at 4:30. A former United States Army interrogator, trained specifically to identify exactly that kind of structural break, flagged it immediately. And the interviewer sitting directly across from Warren never asked the question that needed to be asked. Which one was it? That question has not been answered publicly. It was not answered in the interview. It has not been addressed since. And until a formally trained investigator sits across from Warren Hudson in a controlled setting and requires him to reconcile those 2 statements with the discipline that a real interrogation demands, it remains open. Does that mean something happened to Nolan that has not been admitted to? That cannot be stated here. Nobody watching this video has enough information to make that determination from a recorded interview and a body of pending evidence. What can be stated is this. A 90-minute window sits at the center of everything. 3 to 4:31. The one public account that tried to fill that window has a visible gap inside it. The evidence surrounding that window is still being processed. The question this case keeps returning to is not only what happened to Nolan Wells. It is whether the people who were supposed to explain what happened to him have given the full picture. That is the question the grand jury will examine. That is the question the phone inspection is working to answer. That is the question the autopsies could not resolve. And it is the question that this entire video started with. If the last time you saw your best friend, your brother, in your own words, was 3, how do you know exactly where he was sitting at 4:30? This channel will keep following this case for as long as those answers are still owed to Nolan's family. If you want to be here when the next update drops, when the autopsy findings are unsealed, when the phone inspection concludes, when the grand jury moves, subscribing to Crime with Chris is the only way to make sure you do not miss it. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and drop your answer in the comments below. After everything you have heard across both parts of this breakdown, what do you believe investigators are going to find when those sealed autopsy files are finally opened? What is the detail in this case that stays with you most? We will see you when this story moves.